this trigger a disaster in New Zealand? I was sitting there last night watching that subduction zone and these dangerous trenches there. And then you see these earthquakes lining up there in a short time period, so one after the other. And of course you look at this and you think, is there something going on? And then you look, this is basically between New Zealand and where we had the Tonga earthquake in March this year, a 7.6 earthquake. So is there stress transferring towards New Zealand, and is Shizzy going to hit the fizzy there, is the large question. Because if you look at this earthquake map, basically in the last day and a half, at least 6 earthquakes have lined up like beads on a string, stretching over 2,000 kilometers. That's roughly 1,700 miles from Samoa past Tonga. And then it goes straight down basically through the Kermadec Trench. It's ending just off New Zealand's own coastline. So many of my viewers have asked me, well, what's going on with us here in New Zealand? So let's have a look at you guys. So the strongest one hit actually this morning, 5.6, and it happened really inside New Zealand's own territory. So the question that everyone's asking right now, the elephant in the room, is this a warning sign? Is something building? And could it wake up a fault line that is way more dangerous than any of these? So let's break that down. So here is what we're looking at the earthquake map, right? Over about 30 hours, July 20th into July 21st, 6 quakes fired off along of one of the most violent plate boundaries on Earth. That's why we definitely look at this when we see stuff like this happening. We're talking about, this is the Tonga-Kermadec subduction zone. And of course, after this March earthquake, we're seeing aftershocks around the Tonga quake epicenter. That's for sure. But now that this is lining up there, we have magnitude 5.0 south of the Kermadec Islands, 5.0 near Samoa, 4.9 north of Tonga. This one is deeper. This one is actually roughly 95 miles down, roughly 114 kilometers down. And then we have 4.8 southwest of Vanuatu, but don't look at that. That's a different segment. We also had a big earthquake in Vanuatu, so probably aftershocks. That's not the same boundary. So this shows up in the map, but let's not have a look at this for now. But 4.6 south of Fiji, and the big one that I want to look at right now, it's the 5.6, guys, in the Kermadec region itself, just hit this morning. So here's the geology so that we can better understand whether we should freak out right now or not, and what might be happening down there. It's very important to know that. We know subduction zone, right? Pacific Ring of Fire. Pacific plate is diving underneath the Australian plate here at up to 24 centimeters per year. So that's 9.5 inches per year. So this is one of the fastest conversion rates on the entire planet, faster than any other subduction zone along the Pacific Ring of Fire. That's an engine, guys. That is the engine that's happening there. This trench does not just produce earthquakes, it produces some of the strongest earthquakes like anywhere. And it's regularly, unfortunately, topping magnitude 8 and higher. So is this cluster connected? That's the important question right now. So we're looking at this exact sequence, and there is one important finding. The depth of these earthquakes, they don't match up. What does that mean? We have the shallow quakes, Kermadec, Samoa, happened right at the plate boundary in the upper crust. But that 4.9 earthquake that is near Tonga happened much deeper, basically inside the Pacific plate itself, after it's already been swallowed into the mantle in that subduction zone. So we call this an intra-slab earthquake, and it's a completely different mechanism than what we have with the others in a shallow boundary rupture. So let me translate this into easy words. So these are not aftershocks of the one big earthquake in March. And that's crucial. So if they're not aftershocks, what are they then? Foreshocks? Or are they just normal stuff? So there's no single main shock here for these earthquakes. Not yet. Hopefully it remains like that. So basically what we're dealing with here, this is multiple independent ruptures at the same fault system in the same general window of time. So that's why we're looking at this, right? The timing is a little bit suspicious. The current data that we're getting, it shows no direct rupture connection between them. So is that suspicious still, or is it's just what like an extremely active plate boundary does on a normal day? It's Tuesday today. I'm trying to give you my honest answer here to keep it like plain fact-based. So here's the uncomfortable truth that comes with it for what is happening there. This pattern all by itself is not statistically unusual for this stretch of trench. The Kermadec Tonga zone produces magnitude 4 till magnitude 6 earthquakes basically constantly. So seeing 6 of them spread across a distance of like 2,000 kilometers, over 1,600 miles, and in a time frame of 30 hours is, we can say, yeah, it's still well within normal background activity for one of the most seismically active regions on the whole planet. So scientists have spent a long time, decades, hunting for a way to look at a sequence like this when it occurs and say, this is now the proof, the big one is coming. But unfortunately, that proof, that method doesn't exist yet. No clustering pattern, no lineup on a map can reliably predict a major earthquake. But and this, I guess, is the part worth sitting with, I would say. That doesn't mean the risk isn't real and that the risk isn't there and that this could be something. It means the risk also, we have to say, was always there, whether this cluster happened or not. Even without a cluster like this, it can poof from 1 second to the next. As we like to say here, shizzy can hit the fizzy. So I think the real question here when we look at that earthquake map, and this really deserves a real answer, and not like a scare tactic or let's be too alarmed or anything. New Zealand, guys, New Zealand sits on top of 2 of its own major hazards that we definitely need to look at. The Hikurangi subduction zone that is running along the east coast of the North Island, and then the famous Alpine fault that is tearing through the South Island. And that's a fault that produces a major rupture roughly every 300 years, and it's now overdue. So basically everyone's waiting for it to happen. So could an earthquake that is hundreds of miles away on the Kermadec Trench trigger either of those faults? That question is absolutely legit. We have no evidence that San Andreas Fault, Cascadia Fault have triggered each other. We know that smaller faults that branch out from the San Andreas Fault, for example, if they rupture and shake around, they can trigger the big one. So could an earthquake that we see here trigger the real bad problem? So in science, we study something that we call dynamic triggering. This is what we're worried here about. Seismic waves from distant quakes occasionally nudging an already stressed fault into an earthquake. It was going to have anyway. It just maybe brings it a little bit earlier. So this is real. Again, it's documented, but it almost always triggers small tremors, not major ruptures. And it typically, thankfully, requires much larger seismic waves than anything in the magnitude 5 range produces at these distances, that far away, right? The waves need to travel to the alpine fault, and of course they lose impact. So could this exact cluster here, because we have several quakes in a short time frame, be the trigger for the alpine fault's next big one? There's no evidence for that, and no mechanism that we see that makes this likely. The real risk to New Zealand from the Hikurangi or the alpine fault is a constant risk every day. It's independent of what is making headlines here at the trench right now. And that's why, thankfully, New Zealand, because it has this huge risk, has one of the best earthquake early warning and building code systems, right, in the world. So why are we talking about this, right? Why am I making this video? Why am I telling you about this if this is not an immediate threat? Definitely not, because these 6 still considered moderate earthquakes are the end of the world. Moderate, if these earthquakes happen underneath a densely populated area, like we just had in Peru, we had it in Afghanistan and Turkey, they can be devastating if you don't have buildings that are up to code, right? So this can be very, very damaging. But of course, they're not the end of the world right now. But we see that there is so much stress in that area right now, along a boundary that most people in the world have never heard of. But we do, right? Every one of these releases energy that was building up for years. This is definitely happening, right? And someday, this exact same trench, we know one of these earthquakes will not stop at magnitude 5.6. So my question at the beginning, will this trigger a disaster in New Zealand? Based on everything we know right now, no. But New Zealand's real risk is bigger than this cluster. I will keep you updated about this, guys. And if you're interested what volcanoes can do along the Pacific Ring of Fire, we know Pacific Ring of Fire, most of the world's biggest earthquakes and volcanic eruption in Kamchatka, where we just had a magnitude 8.8 earthquake, July 2025. This is when this happened. But now we have the Shiviluk volcano erupting in a way that keeps asking the question, could this be a repetition of what happened there in 2023? Because then Canada has a problem. Vancouver has a problem. Where I am, we will have a problem. So check this out. It's in the end screen. Very, very interesting. I see you there in a second, guys. Thank you so much for watching.